London is no stranger to fog. London is situated in a natural basin, and due to the moisture from the river that runs through it, fog has been an ever present fixture in an average Londoner's life. But what happens when centuries of pollutants from coal sticks to the fog and that fog lasts for days? It results in what is considered to be the worst air pollution event in the history of the United Kingdom. It was so bad that the government eventually created legislation to clean up London's air quality. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Jax, and this is Morbidly Macabre, the show where I talk about morbid history, true crime, cryptids, and other spooky topics that might catch my interest. Today we're talking about the worst air pollution event that claimed at least 4,000 lives, if not more, the Great Smog of London. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider hitting that like button. If you want to see more, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as I post every Friday. I also stream over on Twitch 5 to 6 days a week at Jax Marie Gaming. Now let's get right back into the topic. London is no stranger to fog, but it is also no stranger to air pollution. Polluted fog has been an issue in London as far back as the 13th century, due to the burning of coal in homes and at businesses. In the mid-1600s, there were feeble attempts to address this issue, such as legislation passed by King Charles I, which sought to remove smoky industries from Westminster and move it to somewhere else in London, mostly targeted at large brew houses, and it was to make Westminster more beautiful. In the 1700s, industrialization made the conditions much worse. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution contributed to the pollution by replacing what used to be manual jobs with machinery. And these machineries often ran on steam, water, or other power sources, and that involved burning a lot of coal. And it contributed to the pollution to the point that it was making people in that area ill. While it was a benefit to the economy and the population was booming and the business was doing great, it also increased what the Londoners called smog, a merging of the words smoke and fog. Water vapor would stick to the residue from the coal burning and produce dark clouds of fog. These dark and heavy fogs would have a yellow appearance, and they came to be known as pea soupers. I've heard of fog being as thick as pea soup before, but I didn't know that it actually had a color to it, a yellow color. And I never knew the origin of the phrase until researching for today's story. During the Industrial Revolution, people were getting sick from respiratory illnesses, and fog-related deaths were also reported on people's gravestones. But even with people dying from fog-related illnesses, not much was done to address the issue. In December 1952, that all changed. Around this time, the pea super fog that London was accustomed to during the 19th century was getting more infrequent as industrialization was moving outside of the city. On December 5th, London was hit with an anticyclone. An anticyclone is when the winds rotate clockwise around the center of a high-pressure system, and the cold air gets trapped below the surface and the warm air is above. Because of this, the emissions from the factories that normally would rise didn't have that chance to rise and were actually trapped close to the surface. This anticyclone trapped the smog in London, and it remained there for 5 days, finally lifting on December 9th. But how bad was this smog? How thick was it? The smog contained sulfur dioxide, a toxic gas that is released from burning coal, and since the post-World War II coal that was being used was of a low quality, the sulfur dioxide that was released was fairly high. According to the Met Office, on each day during the foggy period, the following pollutants were emitted: 1,000 metric tons of smoke particles, 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide, 140 tons of hydrochloric acid, and 14 tons of fluorine compound. In addition, and perhaps most dangerously, 370 tons of sulfur dioxide were converted into 800 tons of sulfuric acid. A ton, or a metric ton, is 1 to 1,000 kilograms. 1,000 kilograms is 2,204.6 pounds. So 370 tons of sulfur dioxide is approximately 815,710 pounds, which is very roughly equivalent to a Boeing 747. So imagine a Boeing 747 that is not actually a plane, but it is sulfur dioxide. That is what these Londoners were breathing in. And sulfur dioxide is also what gave the pea supers that yellowish hue that it had. It was reported that visibility was so bad, people walking outside couldn't even see their feet. Traffic above ground was basically stopped at a complete standstill because people couldn't see in front of them, making it extremely dangerous for them to even consider driving. Flights were grounded because if you can't see where you're going, why would you fly? Trains were stopped, same issue. If there was a hazard on the track, they couldn't see it. There was no way to know. Even traffic on the River Thames was stopped due to the conditions. Parents with school-aged children were advised to keep their children home, partly because of the respiratory illnesses, but mostly because they were afraid the children would get lost in the fog. And stealing increased since it was just easier for criminals to get away from the crime. It's hard to chase a criminal when you can't see them running away from you. Outdoor games and events were canceled due to the unsafe conditions. The smog was even seeping into buildings as well. Movie theaters had to close due to the haze, making it impossible for theater goers to see the screen. There was a grime that covered surfaces from the residue that clung to the water vapor. Life in London seemingly grinded to a halt for these 5 days. Initial reports at the time estimated around 4,000 people died from the smog. Elderly, young children, and people with existing respiratory problems were especially vulnerable, especially smokers who already had damaged their lungs from smoking. Deaths to pneumonia and bronchitis spiked. In the aftermath, experts estimate at least 8,000 to 12,000 people lost their lives from lasting health issues from this event. Animals were also affected. Birds crashed into buildings, unable to see where they were going. Show cows in Smithfield that were there for an event were reported to have choked on the air and died. And people did try to mitigate the health effects from the smog by wearing masks, not unlike in recent times when we wore masks when we left our houses due to COVID to prevent the spread. However, there's not any concrete data if the masks that they wore during the smog actually helped with the respiratory illnesses, especially since the smog was getting inside their homes. After this event, pollution was an undeniable issue for London, and the government acted on fixing the issue 4 years later. In 1956, with the Clean Air Act, it established smoke-free zones in the city, and it restricted the burning of coal in homes and industrial furnaces. There were also grants offered to help offset the cost of moving everything over, so homeowners would have an incentive to switch from coal to a different heating source, like electricity. It was a slow process, with a similar smog event happening in 1962. This secondary event occurred in December between the 4th and the 7th and resulted in the death of at least 300 to 700 people. While the smoke levels were lower, the sulfur dioxide levels were fairly similar. This event highlighted the weaknesses of the 1956 Clean Air Act, which led to revisions in 1968 and additional regulations introduced in 1974. While it had a slow start, this did lead to an improvement in the public health in the country, and none of the smog events that preceded this event were as deadly as the 1952 Great Smog of London. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you liked today's video, please consider hitting that like button at the bottom of the page. If you really enjoyed today's content and want to see more from me, please consider subscribing to the channel. Like I said, I do post every Friday. I also stream over on Twitch 5 to 6 days per week. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, stay curious. Goodbye.